The bitter wind howled across the Texas plains, carrying with it the promise of a harsh winter that would test even the hardiest souls. Sarah McKenzie pulled her worn buffalo hide coat tighter around herself and her daughter as their weathered wagon creaked along the frozen dirt road leading into Cedar Ridge. The town appeared before them like a mirage of civilization against the endless expanse of prairie, a collection of wooden buildings huddled together as if seeking warmth from each other. Little Star, barely 5 years old, stirred in her mother's arms, her dark eyes, so unlike Sarah's pale blue ones, fluttering open to take in the strange new world. The child's copper-colored skin and high cheekbones told the story that Sarah's presence in this frontier town would soon make uncomfortably clear to its residents. "Mama," Little Star whispered in Comanche, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Are these the people who look like you?" Sarah's weathered hands, marked by 3 years of life on the plains, gently stroked her daughter's long black hair. "Yes, little one, but they may not understand us at first. We must be patient." The wagon wheels crunched through patches of ice as they approached the main street. Cedar Ridge was typical of frontier towns sprouting across Texas, a general store with a false front, trying to appear grander than it was, a saloon with batwing doors that never quite kept out the cold, a small church with a modest steeple, and a handful of other businesses serving the ranchers and settlers who dared to call this unforgiving land home. As their wagon rolled past the general store, conversations stopped. Men paused in their loading of supplies, women ceased their gossiping on the wooden sidewalk, and children pointed with the unabashed curiosity that only the young possess. Sarah felt the familiar weight of stares, some curious, some suspicious, others openly hostile. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Tom Bradley, the store owner, loud enough for his words to carry on the cold air. "What do we have here?" Sarah brought the wagon to a stop in front of Dr. Edmund Hayes's office, a modest building with a simple painted sign swaying in the wind. She had heard in the last settlement that Cedar Ridge had a doctor, and Little Star had been running a fever for 2 days now. The child's small body trembled not just from the cold, but from an illness that had Sarah's heart clenched with fear. "Stay here, precious Star," Sarah whispered, using the English translation of her daughter's Comanche name. She climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long journey, and noticed how the townspeople had gathered at a respectful distance, watching her every move like predators studying unfamiliar prey. The doctor's office door bore a brass nameplate that had seen better days. Sarah knocked, her knuckles raw from the cold. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a middle-aged man with graying hair and spectacles perched on his nose. Dr. Hayes looked her up and down, taking in her unusual clothing, the mixture of frontier dress and Comanche-made accessories, the beadwork on her boots, the way she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to survive in worlds that didn't always want her. "Doctor Hayes?" Sarah's voice carried the refined accent of someone who had once known a different life. "I'm Sarah McKenzie. My daughter is very ill, and I was hoping—" "McKenzie?" The doctor's eyebrows raised. "You're not from around here." "No, sir. We've traveled from far away. My daughter has had a fever for 2 days, and she's getting worse. Please, she needs help." Dr. Hayes glanced over Sarah's shoulder at the wagon, where Little Star lay bundled in blankets, then at the growing crowd of onlookers. His expression grew uncomfortable, the kind of discomfort that comes when social expectations clash with professional duty. "Well, that is—" he cleared his throat. "Perhaps you might be more comfortable seeking help elsewhere. There's a settlement about 20 miles north that might be more suitable." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had encountered this before. The careful rejection, the polite suggestion that she and her daughter find help among their own kind, as if love and need recognized racial boundaries. "Doctor, please." Sarah's voice remained steady, though desperation crept in around the edges. "She's just a child, she's burning with fever." Little Star's weak voice called out from the wagon in Comanche, "Pia, ke, habet?" "Where are you, mother?" The crowd's murmur grew louder at the sound of the unfamiliar language. Sarah heard the whispers. Savage, half-breed, Indian lover, words that cut deeper than the winter wind. Dr. Hayes's face hardened. "Ma'am, I think it's best if you move along. This is a God-fearing town, and we have our standards." Sarah stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on her, hearing the judgment in their whispers. Little Star coughed from the wagon, a sound that sent panic shooting through her mother's heart. The child needed help, and Sarah would fight the entire town if necessary to get it. "I understand," Sarah said quietly, her dignity intact despite the humiliation. "We'll find another way." As she turned to walk back to the wagon, she caught sight of a figure standing in the shadows near the church, an elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes, who had been watching the entire exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read. Pastor William Hartwell, though she didn't know his name yet, seemed different from the others. When their eyes met across the distance, something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or understanding of what it meant to carry secrets that the world might not accept. The abandoned line shack on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge offered little protection from the howling wind, but it was shelter, and Sarah McKenzie had learned to be grateful for small mercies. She had unhitched their old mare and led her into the lean-to that served as a makeshift stable, then carried Little Star inside the drafty cabin where previous travelers had left behind a few sticks of furniture and a stone fireplace blackened by countless fires. Little Star lay on the narrow cot, her small body trembling beneath every blanket and hide Sarah could pile on her. The fever had worsened since their rejection at the doctor's office 3 hours earlier, and the child's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Sarah knelt beside her daughter, pressing a cool, damp cloth to the burning forehead while whispering prayers in both English and Comanche. "Mama," Little Star's voice was barely a whisper, "I'm cold." "I know, precious Star. The fire will warm us soon." Sarah's hands shook as she struck flint to tinder, trying to coax flames from the damp wood she'd found stacked beside the fireplace. The wind kept pulling the smoke back down the chimney, filling the small space with acrid grey clouds that made them both cough. As darkness settled over the prairie, Sarah's desperation grew. She had faced Comanche raids, survived brutal winters on the plains, and endured the loss of her husband to fever 3 years ago, but watching her daughter burn with sickness while the town's only doctor refused to help felt like a special kind of torture. A soft knock at the door made Sarah freeze. In the 3 years since she'd chosen to stay with the Comanche rather than return to white civilization, she had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. She reached for the hunting knife at her belt, a skill learned from necessity, not choice. "Mrs. McKenzie," the voice was gentle, belonging to an older man. "My name is Pastor William Hartwell. I saw what happened today at Dr. Hayes's office. I've brought some things that might help your daughter." Sarah approached the door cautiously. Through a gap in the chinked logs, she could see the elderly man she'd noticed earlier, standing alone in the bitter cold with a leather satchel in his hands and no weapon in sight. "What do you want?" she asked, not opening the door. "To help, if you'll let me. I'm no doctor, but I've tended fever before. I've brought willow bark tea and some other remedies." Little Star coughed behind her, a harsh sound that seemed to echo in the small space. Sarah made her decision and opened the door. Pastor Hartwell stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots and removing his wide-brimmed hat to reveal silver hair and weathered features that spoke of decades under the prairie sun. He moved to Little Star's bedside without ceremony, setting his satchel on the floor and kneeling beside the cot. "May I?" he asked Sarah, his hands hovering over the child. Sarah nodded, watching as the pastor gently felt Little Star's forehead and checked her pulse with practiced movements that seemed at odds with his calling. "How long has she been like this?" 2 days. It started as sniffles, but Sarah's voice broke slightly. "She's all I have left." Pastor Hartwell looked up at her with understanding eyes. "You love her very much. That's clear to anyone with sense." He began unpacking his satchel, revealing small packets of herbs, a tin cup, and other supplies. "Tell me, Mrs. McKenzie, where did you learn to speak Comanche?" Sarah stiffened. "Why does that matter?" "Because this child has been speaking it in her delirium, and if I'm going to help her, I need to understand what she's trying to tell us." For a moment, Sarah studied the pastor's face, searching for signs of the judgment she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, she found only genuine concern and something else, familiarity with the language she'd mentioned. "I lived with the Nemanu, the Comanche, for 3 years," Sarah said quietly. "My first husband and I were traveling to California when our wagon train was attacked. Most were killed. I was taken, but they didn't harm me. Eventually, I chose to stay." Pastor Hartwell nodded, as if this revelation was no more surprising than discussing the weather. He began preparing the willow bark tea, heating water in the tin cup over the fire. "The Comanche are good people, misunderstood by most, but good people. Your daughter, she's half-Comanche." "Yes. Her father was a warrior named Soaring Eagle. He died last winter hunting buffalo." Sarah's voice carried the weight of loss. "After he passed, I knew Little Star needed to know both sides of her heritage. That's why we came here. To try to live in the white world, too. That's a brave choice." The pastor's tone held no judgment. "And a difficult one, as you've discovered." Little Star stirred, muttering in Comanche. Pastor Hartwell leaned closer, listening intently. Sarah watched in amazement as understanding dawned on the old man's face. "She's asking for water," he said softly. "She says the spirits are calling her, but she wants to stay with her mother." Sarah's breath caught. "You understand her?" Pastor Hartwell met her eyes with a look that held decades of secrets. "I spent 15 years as a missionary among the Comanche, Mrs. McKenzie, before I came to Cedar Ridge, before I learned that sometimes God speaks in languages the congregation might not approve of." He turned back to Little Star, beginning to speak to her in fluent Comanche, his voice gentle and reassuring. The child's eyes fluttered open at the familiar sounds, and for the first time in days, she seemed truly present. She responded weakly in Comanche, and Pastor Hartwell smiled, continuing their conversation, while he helped her sip the warm willow-bark tea. "What is she saying?" Sarah asked. "She's telling me about a dream where she was riding across the sky on a painted horse looking for her father. I told her that her father is watching over her, but her journey isn't finished yet. She has important work to do here with her mother." As the night wore on, Pastor Hartwell stayed with them, tending Little Star with a combination of herbal remedies and gentle words in her native tongue. The fever began to break near dawn, and the child finally fell into peaceful sleep. "Why?" Sarah asked as the pastor prepared to leave. "Why are you helping us when the rest of the town—" Pastor Hartwell paused at the door, his weathered hand on the latch. "Because 30 years ago, a Comanche woman named White Dove saved my life when I was dying of snakebite. She tended me for weeks, teaching me her language and her people's ways. When I was well, she told me that kindness creates circles, that what we give comes back to us, sometimes in ways we never expect." He looked back at Little Star, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. "Perhaps this is part of my circle, Mrs. McKenzie. Perhaps it's part of yours too." The church bells of Cedar Ridge rang out across the frozen prairie, their bronze voices calling the faithful to Sunday morning worship. Sarah McKenzie stood at the window of the line shack, watching the townspeople make their way along the main street toward the modest white building with its simple wooden cross. Little Star slept peacefully behind her, the fever finally broken after 3 days of Pastor Hartwell's careful tending. Sarah had been awake since before dawn, wrestling with a decision that could change everything. The pastor's kindness had given her hope, but she knew that his congregation might not share his understanding. Still, Little Star was getting stronger, and they needed more than the temporary shelter of an abandoned cabin. They needed a community, a place to belong, even if that belonging had to be earned through confrontation. "Mama," Little Star's voice was weak but clear for the first time in days. "Are you going to the singing lodge?" Sarah turned from the window, managing a smile at her daughter's Comanche term for the church. "I'm thinking about it, precious Star. How do you feel this morning?" "Better." Pastor Grandfather made the burning go away. Little Star had taken to calling Pastor Hartwell by the Comanche term for a respected elder, and the old man seemed to cherish the title. Sarah helped her daughter sit up and sip some of the herbal tea the pastor had left. Little Star's color was returning, and her breathing had eased, but she was still fragile. The decision Sarah was contemplating would put them both at risk. But hiding from the world wasn't the future she wanted for her daughter. "Little Star, how would you feel about going to the singing lodge today? About meeting the people who look like Mama?" The child considered this seriously, as she did most things despite her young age. "Will they understand when I talk to the Great Spirit? They might not understand the words, but maybe they'll understand the feeling." Sarah knelt beside the cot, taking her daughter's small hands in hers. "Sometimes, precious one, we have to be brave even when people don't understand us. Your father always said that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what's right even when you are afraid." Little Star nodded solemnly. "Will Pastor Grandfather be there?" "Yes, he will." "Then we should go. He said the Great Spirit speaks all languages." An hour later, Sarah helped Little Star into the wagon, wrapping her carefully in blankets and furs. The child was weak but determined, and Sarah felt a fierce pride in her daughter's resilience. They made their way slowly down the main street, drawing stares and whispers as they had 3 days earlier, but this time Sarah held her head high. The church was nearly full when they arrived. Sarah could hear the congregation singing a hymn she remembered from her childhood, "Amazing Grace," the familiar melody floating out through the open doors despite the cold. She lifted Little Star from the wagon, and together they walked up the wooden steps. The singing stopped abruptly as they appeared in the doorway. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward them, expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Sarah saw Dr. Hayes in the third pew, his face hardening at the sight of them. Tom Bradley, the store owner, whispered something to his wife that made her frown and pull her own children closer, but Pastor Hartwell, standing at the simple wooden pulpit, smiled warmly and gestured toward an empty pew near the back. "Please, come in. There's always room in God's house for those who seek Him." Sarah felt every step as they made their way to the pew, little Star clinging to her hand with the trust that only a child can show. The congregation settled into an uncomfortable silence, the kind that precedes either acceptance or explosion. Pastor Hartwell opened his worn Bible, his eyes finding Sarah and little Star before addressing his congregation. "Today I want to speak about the story of Ruth," he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in the pulpit. A foreign woman who chose to stay with her mother-in-law Naomi, saying, "Your people shall be my people, and your God my God." As the sermon continued, little Star grew restless. The child had been raised with the Comanche tradition of expressing spiritual feelings openly, and the rigid silence of the white church service confused her. She began to whisper questions to Sarah in Comanche, drawing sharp looks from nearby parishioners. "Mama," little Star said, her voice carrying in the quiet church, "when do we talk to the Great Spirit?" The whispers started immediately. Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, little Star suddenly grew alarmed. The child had been looking around the church, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, when her eyes fixed on something that frightened her, a large wooden cross hanging behind the pulpit. To little Star, raised with Comanche beliefs about spiritual symbols, the cross looked like an instrument of suffering, not salvation. She began to cry, and in her distress she did what came naturally. She began to pray aloud in Comanche, asking the Great Spirit to protect them in this strange place with its frightening symbols. "Ata aquina inua usaku etu u," she began, her young voice carrying clearly through the silent church. The reaction was immediate and harsh. People began to murmur angrily, some standing as if to leave. "This is a house of God, not a place for heathen chanting," someone called out. "Take that half-breed child somewhere else." Sarah felt the familiar surge of protective fury, but before she could respond, something extraordinary happened. Pastor Hartwell stepped down from the pulpit, his weathered face calm and purposeful. He walked slowly down the aisle toward them, and as he walked he began to speak in Comanche, his voice joining little Star's prayer. The church fell silent except for the two voices, the frightened child and the elderly pastor, both speaking to God in a language most of the congregation had never heard. Pastor Hartwell knelt beside their pew, continuing the prayer, his fluent Comanche flowing with the rhythm and beauty of a language learned through years of genuine relationship with its speakers. "Pu u naku usaku, itu umia hakaina inua," he concluded, then looked up at his stunned congregation and translated. She was asking God to bless this place and all the people in it, and to help them understand that we are all His children, no matter what language we use to call His name. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel little Star's small hand relaxing in hers as the child realized she was not alone in this strange place. 40 faces stared at their pastor, as if seeing him for the first time, trying to reconcile the man they thought they knew with this revelation of his hidden past. Dr. Hayes was the first to speak, his voice tight with anger. "Pastor Hartwell, what is the meaning of this spectacle?" Pastor Hartwell rose slowly, his dignity intact and his purpose clear. "The meaning, Dr. Hayes, is that God hears prayers in every language. The meaning is that this child was asking for His blessing on all of us, and I thought it only proper to help her finish what she started." He looked around the church, meeting each person's eyes in turn. "The question isn't what language we use to pray. It's whether we have the heart to recognize prayer when we hear it." The silence in the Cedar Ridge church stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Pastor Hartwell stood in the aisle, his silver hair catching the morning light streaming through the simple windows, while his congregation struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Sarah held little Star close, feeling the child's confusion at the adult tension surrounding them. Margaret Whitman, the banker's wife and unofficial leader of the church's women's circle, was the first to find her voice. She stood slowly, her black Sunday dress rustling in the quiet, her face pale with shock and something approaching betrayal. "Pastor Hartwell," she said, her voice trembling with controlled emotion, "in the 5 years you've served our community, you never once mentioned that you spoke that savage tongue, How could you keep such a thing from us?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation. Sarah watched as the man who had shown them such kindness faced the judgment of his own flock, and she felt a stab of guilt for bringing this trouble upon him. Pastor Hartwell returned to the front of the church, his movements deliberate and calm. "I kept it from you, Mrs. Whitman, because I knew how you would react. I knew that the moment you learned I had lived among the Comanche, had learned their language and their ways, you would see me differently. And I was right, wasn't I?" Tom Bradley stood up, his face flushed with anger. "You're damn right we see you differently. We trusted you with our souls, our children's souls, and all this time you've been, what, some kind of Indian sympathizer? A man who lived with murderers and thieves?" "The Comanche are not murderers and thieves," Pastor Hartwell replied firmly. "They are people trying to survive in a world that grows smaller every day. They love their children, honor their elders, and worship the same God we do. They just call him by a different name." Dr. Hayes rose from his pew, his medical authority lending weight to his words. "This is exactly the kind of dangerous thinking that leads to situations like this." He gestured towards Sarah and Little Star. "You encourage them, Pastor, and soon we'll have every half-breed and Indian lover thinking they belong in decent society." Little Star pressed closer to her mother at the harsh words, and Sarah felt her protective instincts flare. But before she could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Everyone turned to see Martha Collins, a weathered widow who lived alone on a homestead east of town. She was known for her sharp tongue and practical nature, not for defending strangers. She stood slowly, her arthritis evident in her careful movements, but her voice was strong. "I've listened to enough foolishness for one morning," Martha continued. "Pastor Hartwell has been nothing but good to this community for 5 years. He's buried our dead, baptized our children, and comforted us in our darkest hours. If he learned to speak Comanche while doing God's work, then I say that makes him more qualified to serve us, not less." "But Martha," Margaret Whitman protested, "surely you can't approve of this mixing of races, this corruption of Christian worship with heathen practices." "What I saw," Martha interrupted, "was a sick child praying to God for comfort, and our pastor helping her do it. If that offends your delicate sensibilities, Margaret, then maybe you need to think harder about what Christianity actually means." The church began to divide visibly. Some nodded in agreement with Martha's words, while others looked scandalized by her defense of the pastor. Sarah realized that Pastor Hartwell's revelation had exposed fault lines in the community that had probably existed long before she and Little Star arrived. Pastor Hartwell raised his hand for attention, and the murmuring gradually ceased. "I think you all deserve to know the full truth," he said. 32 years ago I went west as a young missionary, full of righteous certainty about bringing civilization to the savage tribes. I was captured by a Comanche war party, and I expected to die." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "Instead, they took me to their village, where a woman named White Dove tended my injuries. She could have let me die. I was, after all, part of the people who were taking their land and killing their buffalo. But she nursed me back to health, and in the months of my recovery, I learned something that changed my life forever." The congregation hung on his words despite their anger, drawn by the authority of confession. "I learned that the Comanche are not the monsters we make them out to be. They are fathers who worry about providing for their families, mothers who sing lullabies to their children, young people who fall in love and dream of the future. They have laws and customs and deep spiritual beliefs. They showed me kindness when they could have shown me death." Tom Bradley shook his head. "Pretty words, Pastor, but they still raid settlements and kill innocent people. And we still drive them from their ancestral lands and slaughter their food source," Pastor Hartwell replied quietly. "Violence breeds violence, Mr. Bradley. But today, in this church, we have a chance to choose understanding over fear, compassion over hatred." He turned to look at Sarah and Little Star, and his expression grew tender. "This woman chose love over safety when she stayed with the Comanche. This child is the living bridge between two worlds that seem determined to destroy each other. They're not here to threaten us. They're here seeking the same thing we all want, a place to belong, a community to call home." Dr. Hayes stood again, his jaw set with determination. "Pastor, you're asking us to accept the unacceptable. That child is half Indian, born of sin and savagery. The woman chose to live in degradation rather than return to Christian civilization. How can we welcome such people into our community?" Before Pastor Hartwell could respond, Little Star surprised everyone by standing up in the pew. Despite her weakness from the recent illness, the 5-year-old faced the congregation with a dignity that seemed far beyond her years. "I am not sin," she said in careful English, her young voice carrying clearly through the church. "I am Little Star. My mama loves me, and Pastor Grandfather says the Great Spirit loves me too. I did not choose my father's skin or my mama's skin. I only choose to be good." The simple honesty of her words hit the congregation like a physical blow. Here was a child, sick, frightened but brave, defending her right to exist with more grace than many of the adults had shown all morning. Sarah stood beside her daughter, placing a protective hand on the child's shoulder. "My daughter is right," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "We came here seeking nothing more than a chance to live peacefully, among people who share some of our heritage. If that's too much to ask, we'll move on, but we will not apologize for who we are or how we came to be." The church fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different, less hostile, more thoughtful. Martha Collins began to clap, a slow, deliberate sound that echoed in the wooden building. Gradually others joined her, not all but enough to matter. Pastor Hartwell smiled, and Sarah realized that the man who had helped save her daughter had just risked everything he had built in Cedar Ridge to defend their right to belong. The battle wasn't won yet, but for the first time since arriving in town, she felt something that had been missing for too long: hope. 3 weeks after the confrontation in the church, Cedar Ridge found itself changed in ways both subtle and profound. The initial storm of controversy had given way to something more complex, a community genuinely wrestling with questions it had never been forced to ask before. Sarah McKenzie stood in the doorway of the cabin that Martha Collins had offered to rent to her and Little Star. It wasn't much, 2 rooms behind the general store that Tom Bradley had grudgingly agreed to let after Martha had cornered him with some pointed questions about Christian charity. But it was warm, dry, and most importantly, it was theirs. Little Star had made a remarkable recovery, her natural resilience aided by proper food, warmth, and the herbal remedies that Pastor Hartwell continued to provide. The child had also made an unexpected friend, 7-year-old Emma Bradley, Tom's youngest daughter, who had approached Little Star with the fearless curiosity that children possess before adults teach them to be afraid. "Mama, can Emma come to our talking circle today?" Little Star asked, using her term for the informal gatherings that had begun forming around their small cabin. What had started as Martha Collins stopping by to check on them had gradually expanded to include other women from town, not all but more than Sarah had dared hope. "If her mother says yes, precious Star." Sarah smiled as she watched her daughter carefully braid Emma's blonde hair with the intricate patterns she had learned from Comanche women. The sight of the 2 children together, their different heritage forgotten in the simple joy of friendship, had done more to change hearts in Cedar Ridge than all the sermons and arguments combined. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah opened it to find Dr. Hayes standing on her doorstep, his medical bag in hand and an expression of uncomfortable determination on his face. This was the moment she had been both hoping for and dreading. "Mrs. McKenzie," he said, clearing his throat awkwardly, "I was wondering if I might— that is, I heard Little Star had been coughing again and I thought perhaps—" Sarah studied his face, seeing the struggle between professional duty and personal prejudice. "She's been much better, Dr. Hayes, but I appreciate your concern. May I?" He gestured toward the cabin and Sarah stepped aside to let him enter. Little Star looked up from her play with Emma, her dark eyes wary but not frightened. The doctor knelt beside her with careful movements, as if approaching a young deer that might bolt at any sudden motion. "Hello, Little Star. I'm Dr. Hayes. May I listen to your breathing?" The child looked to her mother, who nodded encouragingly. As the doctor performed his examination, Sarah was struck by the gentleness of his touch, the professional competence that transcended personal feelings. "Her lungs are clear," Dr. Hayes announced, straightening up. "Whatever Pastor Hartwell gave her seems to have done the trick." He paused, then added quietly, "I should have helped her when you first came to town. A doctor's duty is to heal, regardless of other considerations." "Thank you for saying that," Sarah replied. "And thank you for coming now." Dr. Hayes nodded stiffly and prepared to leave, but Little Star's voice stopped him at the door. "Dr. Hayes, in Comanche medicine we say that healing someone makes them part of your family. Pastor Grandfather taught me that white medicine says the same thing, only with different words." The doctor turned back, his expression softening as he looked at the earnest child. "Your Pastor Grandfather is a wise man, Little Star. Perhaps you could teach me some of those Comanche words for healing sometime." After he left, Sarah felt another small piece of the wall around their new life crumble away, Change was happening slowly, one conversation at a time, one act of kindness at a time. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her to the window. Pastor Hartwell was riding up on his old mare, but he wasn't alone. Behind him rode a group of 5 Comanche warriors, their presence causing immediate stir in the town. Sarah's heart clenched with recognition. She knew these men. "Little Star," she called softly. "Come here, precious one." The child joined her at the window, and her face lit up with joy. "Uncle Running Bear! Mama, it's Uncle Running Bear and the others!" Sarah stepped outside as the riders approached, aware that half the town was watching from windows and doorways. The lead rider, a man in his 40s with graying braids and the bearing of a chief, dismounted and approached her with dignity. "Sister who chose us," he said in Comanche, using the name they had given her years ago, "we have come to see that you and the little star are well." Pastor Hartwell dismounted as well, his face showing the strain of the tense ride into town. "Mrs. McKenzie, Running Bear insisted on coming when word reached their band that you were here. I thought it best to accompany them to help explain." Sarah looked around at the gathering crowd of townspeople. Fear was written on many faces, but also curiosity. This was the moment that would truly test how much Cedar Ridge had changed. "Running Bear," she said in English for the benefit of the listeners, "I am honored by your visit. Little Star, come greet your uncle." The child ran to the Comanche warrior, who swept her up in his arms and spoke to her in their native tongue. The sight of a white woman greeting Comanche warriors as family, of a mixed-race child being embraced with obvious love, created a tableau that forced the watching townspeople to confront their assumptions about savage enemies and civilized allies. Martha Collins stepped forward from the crowd, her chin raised with characteristic determination. "Are these the child's people?" she asked Sarah directly. "Some of them," Sarah replied. "Running Bear is her father's brother. They've come to make sure we're safe and well cared for." Running Bear set Little Star down and looked around at the gathered white faces. When he spoke, it was in careful English learned through years of necessity. "We do not come for war. We come for family. Sister and Little Star are precious to us. We want to know they are welcome here." Tom Bradley stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun at his hip before he caught himself. "You're not welcome here, Indian. Take your kind and get out." The tension ratcheted up immediately, hands moving to weapons on both sides. But before violence could erupt, Little Star stepped between the two groups, her small voice cutting through the adult anger. "Stop," she said firmly, switching between English and Comanche. "Uncle Running Bear, these are the people who gave me medicine and a home. Mr. Bradley, Uncle Running Bear taught me to ride and tells the best stories about Star who runs across sky." She looked around at all the adults, her young face serious with understanding beyond her years. "Mama says that people are afraid of what they don't know, but I know all of you now. You're not enemies. You're just different kinds of family." Pastor Hartwell stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of his calling. "The child speaks wisdom that shames us all. Running Bear, you are welcome in our town as long as you come in peace. Mr. Bradley, these men have ridden many miles out of concern for a little girl's welfare. Surely that's something we can understand and respect." The standoff stretched for long moments, the future of Cedar Ridge hanging in the balance. Finally, Martha Collins broke the tension in her characteristic way. "Well, if they've come all this way, the least we can do is offer them a meal and a place to rest their horses. Hospitality is supposed to be a Christian virtue, isn't it, Pastor?" Running Bear looked to Sarah, who nodded with a small smile. "Thank you," he said to Martha. "We accept." As the afternoon wore on, something remarkable happened. The initial fear gave way to curiosity, and curiosity led to conversation. Pastor Hartwell served as translator, but increasingly people found ways to communicate through gestures, shared meals, and the universal language of watching children play together. Emma Bradley sat wide-eyed as Running Bear told stories of the great buffalo herds, while her father found himself in reluctant conversation with one of the younger warriors about horses and weather. Dr. Hayes discovered that Comanche medicine had treatments for ailments he'd never successfully addressed, leading to an exchange of knowledge that benefited both sides. As evening approached and the Comanche prepared to leave, Running Bear approached Sarah one final time. "Sister," he said in Comanche, "you have chosen well. These people learn. The little star will grow strong here, knowing both worlds." Sarah translated his words for the townspeople who had gathered to see them off. "He says little star will be strong because she knows both worlds. He's giving his blessing to our life here. As the riders disappeared into the prairie darkness, Cedar Ridge settled into a new kind of quiet. Not the silence of fear or hatred, but the thoughtful quiet of a community that had discovered something valuable about itself. Later that evening, as Sarah tucked little Star into bed in their own cabin, the child asked, "Mama, are we home now?" Sarah looked around at their simple rooms, thought about the gradual acceptance they'd found, the friendships slowly forming, the barriers slowly coming down. "Yes, precious Star, I think we are." Outside their window, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled in the darkness, a small frontier town that had learned, one difficult conversation at a time, that home was big enough for everyone willing to build it together. And in the church at the center of town, Pastor Hartwell prepared for Sunday's sermon, knowing that his congregation would never again assume that God spoke only one language or loved only one kind of people. The circle that White Dove had spoken of so many years ago was finally beautifully complete.